The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
Campus of the University of the District of Columbia. This is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and with me is Karen Tramontano, and joining us later is the Reverend Mark Thompson. Our topic today, Black homeownership, or should I say the abysmally low level of Black homeownership in the United States today. Here we are in 2021, and Black homeowners have not recovered from the foreclosure crisis of 2008. A white high school dropout is more likely to own a home than a Black college graduate. Well, to give us the historical arc, we have the perfect guest, Professor Jim Carr. Professor Jim Carr is a housing finance and urban policy consultant. He was formerly the Coleman A. Young Endowed Chair at Wayne State University, senior executive at one time at Fannie Mae, and has taught at Columbia University. Honored to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
So how is it that we have these numbers of the lack of Black home ownership in 2021? What explains this?
We just commemorated the 100th anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it turns out that the gap in home ownership attainment between Blacks and whites in 1921 was smaller than it is today. And when we talk about the 2008 downturn, that's when the whole market turned down. But Black home ownership, because Blacks had been targeted earlier in the process for subprime predatory loans, Black home ownership actually peaked way back in 2004. So Blacks were dealing with a foreclosure crisis long before it became the nightly news.
Weren't there any efforts? I thought there were initiatives advanced by the federal government to address it.
Mayor, that is an outstanding question, because the answer is that there were initiatives, and those initiatives actually are responsible for building that even greater gap between Black and white homeownership attainment. Because prior to 1934, there was no formal federal housing finance system. So trying to get a mortgage loan was difficult for anyone, Black or white, rich or poor. It was just challenging. With the establishment of FHA in 1934 and the Federal Home Loan Corporation, and then several other federal agencies that came behind them, they actually took private discriminatory actions and institutionalized them, codified them, and made them the law. And so it was the housing finance system that was put together by the federal government that actually institutionalized redlining. And if you look at segregation in America, you'll see it's very clear that those policies of the federal government, in fact, greatly exacerbated discrimination, promoted home ownership for non-Hispanic white households, and left Blacks to either have no access to mortgage credit or to have the most predatory forms of lending, or alternatively, even if they weren't predatory, high cost lending. So we're challenged by a number of obstacles, but those obstacles include federal policies that represent institutional biases that still have not been removed from the housing finance system.
Professor Carr, was the Fair Housing Act designed to change some of these policies?
And so the Fair Housing Act barred discrimination in housing. And then after that was another act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And what happened then was discrimination didn't go away. It just changed from the more blatant, overt forms to much more subtle forms. And many of those subtle forms of discrimination continue today. And so if you look at things like how the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, go about pricing mortgages, you'll notice, for one thing, they charge on something called loan level pricing, which means that every borrower is evaluated and charged a fee that is based on their unique risk characteristics. What is ironic about that, or patently unfair, is that the reason that Blacks are more likely to be considered high risk is that years of discrimination against them has left them with less wealth to put, for example, on a down payment. So the lower your down payment, the more you're going to pay for a guarantee fee. That is patently unfair when we have a history of federal discrimination that barred Blacks from owning, so they don't have parents and grandparents who can help them out with inheritances and help them buy that first-time home. Those inheritances, specifically from housing, is one of the greatest sources of wealth for non-Hispanic white households, and it explains part of the reason why a white dropout can have a home ownership rate that's higher than a college graduate, because part of their ownership comes from their parental help and from inheritances.
And what else is baked in the system that we don't know about?
So one of the most offensive is that after the housing market collapsed, the federal agencies in the past, they would estimate everyone's risk, and then they would pool that risk, and they charge basically anybody who qualified for a loan. If you met the standards, you'd pay basically the same thing. After 2010, after the housing crisis collapsed, the agencies started charging every individual borrower at an individual borrower level, which is patently unfair because the things that they charge you more for example, are having lower down payments. Well, how can Blacks have higher down payments if historically they've been discriminated against? In fact, a large share of Blacks are considered unbanked, but that doesn't mean that they're not good credit risk. It simply means that historically they've had no real formal relationships with financial institutions. And so there are several of these practices that currently exist. The federal agencies are aware of it, and they do not change them at all. There have been many studies on this. The institutional biases really need to go.
Do you think President Biden, I know Secretary Fudge has indicated a real commitment to Black homeownership, get the depth of the problem and that the government itself is part of the problem?
I believe they do, but they have, they're climbing uphill. Home prices are accelerating, which makes it more difficult for Blacks to enter home ownership. White unemployment is about 5%. For Blacks is a little over 9%. So they have both the housing finance system issues, and they have to deal with these historic economic inequalities if we are really going to see a closing of the gap in home ownership attainment and ultimately wealth equality.
We're very, very grateful to have had you here today on State of Play.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, our topic today, Black home ownership, and why we're still struggling with this 4 centuries after significant numbers of African Americans arrived in this country. We've talked about its history, we've talked about policies today, but now we have someone who has made it almost a pillar of her tenure as Secretary of HUD. She is the 18th Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and only the 2nd African-American woman to occupy this space. It's such an honor to have with us the Honorable Marcia Fudge. Thank you for being here.
Mayor, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Secretary Fudge, you have made this a significant focus of your tenure. What are the 1 or 2 things you think you can do to begin to turn this around?
Well, I think that there's so many things we can do, but I'd say the top 2 would be how we determine who is creditworthy. FHA basically holds about half of all of the mortgages for first-time home buyers, but credit has always been a major problem. So first we have to decide how we look at credit. And one of the things that we've already done is decide that we're going to neutralize student debt, because low income and people of color carry most of the student debt in this country. And so they have been unfairly, in my opinion, denied the kind of ability to buy homes that they should be. And the second thing we're going to do is to assist with first-time home buyer down payment assistance. We know that most people who rent can't afford a mortgage. Their problem is the assistance is the down payment on the front end. So we're going to try to make sure that we can put every single person in a home with at least 10% equity in that property. It gives them the desire to stay in the property. It also assists them in making sure that they can meet those payments. So we're looking at, those are the two major things: down payment assistance for first-time home buyers and how we determine credit worthiness.
Well, those are two very significant initiatives that could really begin to make a difference. But obviously, you need the support of other agencies such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and Department of Justice, and even your partners at Fannie and Freddie. Do you feel that there is that kind of collective resolve with this administration?
Let me just say that the president and vice president have been so very clear that every agency of this government is to look at our work through a lens of equity. We know that the gap between Black and white ownership today is the same as it was in 1968. They have basically said to me, go for it. They have said, let's try to fix it on our watch. The president is all the way committed to making this happen, even to the point where we are now looking at how we appraise properties, how undervalued Black properties in Black neighborhoods have been over the years, as opposed to counterparts that have the exact same housing stock. So the president is all in, as is CFPB and other agencies. We are a team. We are working across agencies and everybody is involved.
That's very encouraging because we certainly saw what happened during the foreclosure crisis. I think 25 years of net worth was lost. And the African-American community never recovered. But we are very encouraged by your leadership, Secretary Fudge, and this great partnership with President Biden and Vice President Harris. As Jesse Jackson used to say, we will keep hope alive. And thank you so much for being here on State of Play.
Oh, absolutely.
Welcome back to State of Play. Our topic today, Black homeownership. So Karen and I are drilling down on that topic. And now we have someone who's quite the expert, Professor Elizabeth Korver-Glenn. She is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. And she's also the author of quite a provocative book called The Race Brokers, Housing Markets and Segregation in 21st Century Urban America. What a delight to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I have to begin with, what are race brokers?
Well, race brokers are powerful gatekeeping individuals within any sphere, and in my particular area of study, housing markets, that control the kinds of ideas we have about race and how race matters in everyday life. I use the phrase race brokers to not just refer to real estate brokers, but to a variety of individuals who are working kind of in the middle between consumers and the market itself. So for example, in my book, I talk about housing developers, real estate agents, mortgage lenders and loan officers, and appraisers. And these are all individuals who are positioned in industries that have a great deal of power in how housing and homeownership play out.
Walk us through the process. I mean, how does this actually happen?
So in my book, I talk a lot about not just kind of the ideas, and particularly the racist ideas that get used over and over again by real estate professionals, but I also talk about industry and organizational norms and policies that incentivize, or at least don't discourage, this kind of behavior. So I talk about how real estate brokerages and the real estate brokerage industry, for instance, encourage real estate agents to do what I call cultivating networks of value. Real estate agents police and protect the percentage-based commission, and they also pursue social networking as a primary strategy for building their customer bases. And white real estate agents in particular interpret this cultivation of value in a racialized way. So they try to cultivate networks and they try to build business among other white people, whether they're consumers or professionals, and they intentionally avoid and exclude consumers in neighborhoods of color. The appraisal industry still today uses as a primary method of appraising homes the sales comparison approach. This is the method that was instituted back in the days of redlining. And while the explicitly racist kind of logic of redlining is no longer on the books officially, the method that it birthed is the primary way that appraisers today still actually value homes. And they use very similar logics, often unofficial or informally stated behind the scenes about evaluating homes in neighborhoods of color and white neighborhoods in dramatically different ways. And they use this logic to actually implement the sales comparison approach.
So what's the real impact on a Black homeowner or who is selling, or an African-American who is buying into the market? Like, how does it just break down for them in a real way?
So one of the things I talk about in my book is that when you have real estate agents, for example, who are cultivating racially segregated networks, that means that, for instance, they're marketing homes to basically racially homogenous pools of potential consumers. And this is something I've written about elsewhere, the issue of pocket listings, which is when real estate agents kind of privately market homes that are for sale. They don't list them publicly on a local multiple listing service or MLS, and they'll just privately market for sale homes to the individuals in their network. And when that happens, if their network is racially homogenous, and in the case of white real estate agents, I've found that their networks are very homogenous and overwhelmingly white. This means that they're marketing private listings to a predominantly white clientele and disproportionately excluding prospective home buyers of color. In the case of appraisals, we, along with my colleague, Dr. Junia Howell, we've looked at actually how this happens. Between 1980 and 2015, the racial inequality in home values multiplied by about 5 times, holding constant that historical effect of redlining. And so what that means is that the contemporary appraisal practices, like the ones that I talk about in my book, are having an enormous impact on the extent to which home buyers of color are able to kind of get returns out of their home ownership investment. So for me, when I think about the home ownership gap, I'm not just thinking about, unequal access to homeownership. I'm thinking about the unequal returns to homeownership that we see play out so dramatically today and every day in the housing market. And I think that these kind of inequities are probably actually being exacerbated in the current hot housing market that we're experiencing right now.
So, Professor, if I got a Black broker and I'm out looking for a home, would that help?
It's possible. Black brokers that I interviewed and observed in the field work that I conducted, the research I conducted, did at times work in white neighborhoods, but I also observed numerous instances of Black brokers who were actively excluded by white real estate professionals from accessing particular spaces. For instance, white architects, other white brokers who would not work with real estate professionals of color, including Black brokers, thus really circumscribing, cutting off the number of opportunities, and even more importantly, where the homeownership opportunities are for the clients of Black brokers. So where Black brokers can show homes is often contingent on how those homes are marketed. And if they're being marketed by white brokers in white neighborhoods who are policing people who come to their open houses, who are using private pocket listings as a method, this means that, Black brokers, even if they're working really hard to get their clients into as many possible homeownership opportunities as they can, they're still running into these barriers. They're still running into the fact that real estate acumen in our US housing market is really organized around ideas about anti-Blackness and racism.
So which of these brokers would you say prove more devastating? Is it the developer who, designs, I guess, a neighborhood where they intended to be white, or is it the broker, or is it the mortgage banker?
Every single one of these pieces is part of a broader puzzle, which is really the kind of the common sense of how the US housing market is organized, and which the Fair Housing Act didn't do much to interrupt in terms of the norms and unofficial policies that still play out often behind the scenes, but even in kind of public places as well.
And seems like a system that's, racism is totally baked in. So what's it costing us?
The sort of cultural and economic reality of trying to become a homeowner in our society that's rewarded by tax breaks and things like that continues to actually come with very, very high costs to Black and Latinx homeowners in particular, who are more likely to be targeted with high cost mortgage loans and thus are paying more money for mortgages on similar homes relative to their white counterparts. It hurts Black and Latinx homeowners who are trying to sell their homes and who run into issues where the appraisal doesn't meet even what the buyer is offering. This happens also quite frequently. And so they're unable to build wealth. And so there are a variety of ways, but in particular, the costs are very, very pernicious for Black and Latinx homeowners, and consequently for Black and Latinx neighborhoods, which continue to feel the effects not only of historic redlining, but also these contemporary realities of overpaying and over kind of exploiting basically Black and Latinx communities, extracting more out of them relative to white communities. We haven't ever fully grasped the extent to which these costs have been borne by communities of color. And we still don't actually know what the exact dollar value is in terms of dollars lost for Black and Latinx homeowners through these very racist and racialized processes. But it's big. I mean, even in just Baltimore alone, there's like millions of dollars lost in one single city for a very limited time frame.
Well, people bemoan this and talk about Black homeownership. Few have brought such a laser lens to it as have you. It's really startling. We can't thank you enough for your great work and for sharing your insights here on State of Play.
Thank you for having me.
We've learned a lot from Professor Carr in our last interview, and now we want to understand exactly where are we today with the housing gap between Black and white homeowners. And joining us, we have the perfect guest, Dr. Daryl Fairweather. Dr. Fairweather is the chief economist at Redfin. She's also a graduate of MIT in economics, and she has an MA and a PhD from the University of Chicago in behavioral economics. Welcome, Dr. Fairweather.
Thank you for having me.
As the chief economist at Redfin, could you tell us exactly where we are today with this housing gap?
Yes, there is a really large gap in homeownership rates between white Americans and Black Americans. White Americans, about 3/4 of them own homes, whereas for Black Americans, it's less than half. And this is a current fact, but it dates back to historic reasons, historic systemic racism, for example, redlining, racial covenants that excluded Black people from certain neighborhoods, and just run-of-the-mill discrimination of home sellers and real estate agents. So we're still grappling with that today and trying to bridge the gap, but it's not an easy task. In the last 2 decades, we really haven't seen a whole lot of improvement.
So there's been an incredible rise in housing prices. Has that helped Black homeowners to increase their equity position?
It certainly has helped Black homeowners. Home prices have actually gone up more in Black neighborhoods than they have in white neighborhoods during this last year. But unfortunately, in Black neighborhoods, most people tend to be renters. So if you are a Black homeowner, you are in an elite group of Black Americans, and yes, your wealth has increased, but at the same time, it's become harder to break into home ownership for first-time home buyers.
Do you see any differences in other groups, for example, Hispanics or Asian Americans, in terms of the equity position for those demographic groups?
Home equity has been increasing for everybody who owns a home in the last, really since the last housing crash. It has increased more in dollar amounts for white Americans, but in percentage terms, it's increased more for non-white Americans, for Black people, for Hispanics, for Asians. What's interesting about the Hispanic homeownership rate is that it has been improving. It does seem to be improving even more. The Hispanic homeownership rate crossed 50% back in 2020, whereas the Black homeownership rate is still slightly below 50%. But for both Hispanic Americans and Black Americans, their homeownership rates lag significantly behind white Americans.
And did the 2008, 2009 crisis have an impact on Black homeownership?
Absolutely. The housing crash hurt low-income homeowners, it hurt Black homeowners, it hurt Hispanic homeowners, much more. People who were in a precarious position, who had these subprime mortgages and saw their mortgage rates rise, and then they couldn't sell their home to get out from being underwater, they lost their homes. The people who were able to buy homes when homes were at their cheapest point in 2012 were people who had really good credit, had good income histories, and had wealth to begin with. And then as home prices have increased since then, in the last 9 years, the equity that people have gained has largely gone to people who already had a lot of wealth, and people who continued to rent during that time didn't see their wealth increase at all because they weren't homeowners. So the fact that in this country we haven't provided a way for people who don't have perfect credit scores to become homeowners has really hurt people's ability to build wealth and to climb out of whatever their financial situation is and into a higher class, into a higher income bracket.
And how has the pandemic, if at all, affected home ownership?
The pandemic has widened inequality. Or during the pandemic, the people who were able to jump on historically low mortgage rates and buy homes before prices went up, those are people who were financially secure enough to buy a home when the rest of the country was going through a terrible recession. And now that we're coming out of the recession, and people who maybe lost their jobs are looking at buying a home now, prices have already gone up. They've gone up more than 20% since last year. So it's even harder for people to break into home ownership. They can get the low mortgage rate because mortgage rates are still low, but the price is just so high.
And how have appraisals, especially appraisals in African American communities and other communities, how has that affected, the value of homes in those communities?
Homes in Black neighborhoods tend to be valued less than homes in white neighborhoods. And this is when the home has the exact same features, same number of bedrooms, same square footage, is in a neighborhood that has similar school quality, similar crime rates. Basically identical homes, just happen to be that Black people live in the neighborhood versus white people. Those homes tend to be valued more than $40,000 less than white homes. During the pandemic, home prices, home values have skyrocketed. They've gone up more than 20%, and it's been hard for appraisers to keep up with how quickly the housing market has changed. And appraisers are human, they make judgments. When there's room for judgment, there's usually room for bias. I'm not saying it's intentional, but sometimes bias does creep in. So these appraisals definitely matter. And unfortunately, sometimes the appraised value depends on the kind of people that live in the neighborhood and what race they are.
So it sounds like either potential homeowners or Black homers who were selling their home are impacted negatively by bias, sort of at both ends of the transaction.
Yes, and it's something that's really hard to prove in any individual case that there is bias occurring. But when we look at the data, it does seem that homes in Black neighborhoods aren't valued the same as homes in white neighborhoods for anything other than the race of the neighborhood.
And do you see differences, say, regionally, the Northeast region versus the Southwest region? What differences, if any, do you see?
So there are some exceptions. So in Houston, for example, we don't see this gap between Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods and how much they're valued. But a place like Houston has a really strong Black upper middle class of buyers who get to determine for themselves what homes they find valuable. Well, the way that homes are valued is that they're valued mostly by the people who are willing to buy them. And if Black people have wealth and they're able to throw their wealth around, they're the ones who get to determine what homes are worth. And that's why in a place like Houston, we don't see the same discrepancy. When home buyers are predominantly white, their preferences set what the value is. So sometimes it doesn't really have to do with the appraisal, it just has to do with what the people who have the money, what they tend to value. We did a survey recently of Black homeowners. They actually tend to be more affluent than white homeowners. They're upper middle class. as opposed to white homeowners, which tend to just be middle class. So it may have to do with the fact that Black homeowners don't get to benefit as much from intergenerational wealth. And that's why there's this higher standard that exists to becoming a homeowner when you're Black.
All of your experience and research has certainly helped us today. Thank you so much for joining us at State of Play.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Sharon Pratt. Welcome back to State of Play. And as you know, our topic today is Black homeownership, or should I say, the poor, paltry numbers in terms of Black homeownership. We've talked about the historical reasons and policies of the day and what Secretary Fudge and President Biden hope to do. But now we have somebody who's out there where the rubber hits the road, somebody dealing with this issue each and every day, Mark Alston. He is the founder of Skyway Realty, Alston and Associates, and he's a major player with the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. An honor to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Mayor Pratt.
So, we've seen the troubling numbers in terms of African-American home ownership, but yet you make it happen each and every day. What are some of the problems you confront and how do you address those problems?
I think the first problem is perspective. There's such a negative perspective with regard to home ownership, who can buy and who can't buy, that people stop trying. The number one thing we have to do is put our pot in the water. We've got to try to buy no matter what. Home ownership is important. All home ownership matters, but Black home ownership really matters based on our lack of equity and wealth.
Absolutely. So there was a story recently about how you helped these two sisters in Compton manage to become homeowners. In fact, one of the sisters had a dream she'd be a homeowner and dreamt of you. That's quite a compliment. Can you tell us something about that journey?
Our motto here at Alston and Associates is providing quality service to our own community. Like it or not, real estate is it's a segregated business. We typically only have Black clients, and having a reputation in the community over 3 decades of providing service and to people who aren't sure they can buy. The first thing you got to do is treat everybody with respect, whether they're ready or not. If you come to me and you're ready, we're ready. If you come to me and you're not ready, we don't tell you no. What we do is give you a plan. We say, this is the steps you need to take. And even those who don't take the steps, they become your biggest advertising source. Donna Lee Norrington and Mary Josephine Norrington are two of my favorite people, clients that came to me, 60 years old and a little younger for Mary Josephine, wanting to buy a house, but not sure that they could, came across a windfall of $30,000. Both, one works for the city, one works for the state. We had to do a little bit of work on their credit. Then we had to find a community and a property that they could afford. I watched them sit at my desk and cry at closing because they never thought they would be able to own a house. Those were great clients. That's a great story. It's not the first time, but it is probably the most satisfying thing that I can do. I've learned to work for success and not for the dollars. The money is a byproduct of providing success, of being able to see people get keys and get in, and that sense of self-worth that comes from being able to buy a house.
So what are the biggest impediments? Is it an inability to provide, a 20% down payment? Is that typically it? Or is it the credit scores? What is it?
One of the biggest inhibitors is misinformation. You don't need 20% down to buy a house. You can buy a house all over this country with 3.5% down, with as low as a 580 FICO score, FHA, and have 3% interest rates. 5% Fannie Mae. Very rarely do we get 20% down clients. We get clients with minimum down payments all the time, but with high rents, down payments are hard to come by. So down payment assistance programs, and NARAB is now advocating for a restorative justice down payment assistance fund to provide down payment for those who were historically disadvantaged from being able to build wealth and buy a house or have any succession benefits from inheriting property based on actual targeted opposition to buying houses. I think as Black families and Black people, we have to recognize there was actual targeted opposition in the form of exclusionary zoning, redlining, private covenants, urban renewal, and all types of federal and municipal policies that prohibited us from buying houses and building wealth. So we have lower down payments. We have no down payments. First option for us is to find a way to change the down payment, be able to get down payments in America so we can narrow this gap of home ownership.
So let me ask you something. So here we are. I'm Sharon Pratt. I live in Washington, D.C. I see a house that's on the market and I want to buy it. You're telling me I can compete and secure that house with a 3.5% down payment?
Well, you know, it is true that sellers like security when they have an offer. So if you're buying all cash, it's hard to beat that. If you're putting 20, 30, 40% down, it's hard to beat that. But at the end of the day, an FHA loan provides the same cash to the seller that all cash provides. It may take 30 days instead of 10 days, but this is a matter of information or a lack thereof to professionals in this business recognizing that that same offer is good like the all cash offer. It's tougher to compete. We have to bid aggressively. There aren't any deals. And in your city, in your Washington, D.C. area, you guys are 51st out of 50 states in home ownership. Blacks are really suffering in Washington, D.C., but as are all of Washington, D.C. Inhabitants. It is so important that we increase this home ownership and change the perception and make it important again.
The biggest impediment is down payment.
Absolutely.
You're saying it doesn't have to be 20%. Okay, then the other issue is credit scores. And you're saying with a modest down payment, one can get financing at something less than 5% interest rate?
Oh, absolutely. 5%. We haven't done a 5%. I closed a loan for a young lady, FHA, last month at 2.64%, 3.5% down, 30-year fixed, all day, every day. It's misperception, misinformation. Access to credit, there's a lot of low down payment programs that we just have to step up and take advantage of. Again, we are the last on the totem pole in terms of qualifying, but we need to get that low hanging fruit in. We can work on the stuff that's harder, but let's narrow that gap and again, make home ownership important again. Make it important. We've got to talk about the reality of how important it is for our families to own their own properties.
So you take time with the prospective home buyer to help them work through all this process because they have, nonprofits that have to help folks, qualify. How many brokers do what you do? Because I don't hear many stories like the ones you're telling.
Probably not many. And the truth is when Dodd-Frank in its additional criterion for loan originators created barriers and eliminated a lot of loan professionals that look like me. Our clients require a little bit more hands-on. We have to go in areas that other people might not go. Sometimes we've got to sit at the kitchen table and help sort out documents. We've got to be a little more patient. There was one time I came to DC, I was embarrassed to say that I was a mortgage broker because of all the bad press. Mm-hmm. I didn't recruit for a while because of how hard it was in this business. But we've turned that around. I've got 4 young men, all under 29. I'm training right now, including my youngest son, and starting to re-energize this business and the Black participation in the professional originator perspective. It's important that we have people writing loans that look like us.
Well, what do you think of President Biden and Secretary Fudge? I mean, she certainly has stated she's for Black home ownership, but what you have to do to make it a reality is a steep climb. What do you think of what they're doing?
I am excited about I'm excited about Secretary Fudge. I spoke in Columbus, Ohio, right before COVID started in February. She was at the table. We did the state of housing in Black America, and we had a great conversation. I'm excited and encouraged, including her recalculation of student loan debt. Last year's student loan debt, 86.8% of Black students that go to public colleges have student loan debt. Student loan debt, 1.7 trillion, is the #1 debt in America. They standardize that debt calculation for mortgage qualifying across all federal housing finance platform.
We're so glad that you were able to join us on State of Play.
Thank you.
Welcome back to State of Play. Karen and I have been doing a deep dive on the issue of Black home ownership in America. We've talked to Secretary Fudge. We've talked to real estate agents such as Mark Alston. We've talked to major authors in this space. And no matter how you cut it, though many are be hopeful, it's a dispiriting conversation. This notion of racism and resistance to Black home ownership is so baked into the system. At least that's my takeaway.
Well, you know, this is an entire industry from the beginning of when a developer conceives of a project to when that appraisal is happening that is racist throughout. And I think unless, you know, whether it's the Biden-Harris administration or just even on a state level, you know, governors, there's so much cost to this systemic racism in the real estate industry. People should be calling it out and doing something about it and not just trying to figure it out around the edges, because that's not gonna work. That's not gonna solve anything.
No. And, you know, I know that the Biden-Harris team have taken it on, and Fudge has made it a central pillar of her tenure. But you're right, they've got to call it out, because I don't know quite what they do if it's so baked into their biases of a broker who won't even show you the property, or an appraiser who's always going to devalue what you already own. And certainly in terms of getting financing, that the system, you know, the prejudice and biases are baked into that. I mean, it's going to take something major to turn this around. So there's going to have to be a lot more attention to it than we've gotten thus far.
One of our guests said your appraisal is based on if you have your pictures of your African American family on your mantle. I mean, that, you know, I mean, God, this is 2021. What world are we in where that is allowable, right? Where that is happening. And the cost to it is tremendous. I mean, it's everything from the education that we provide our children, the hospitals that are being built in our cities. I mean, mayors and governors should be screaming about the loss of value that's happening. If nothing else, in their own self-interest, they should be screaming about the lack of revenue that's happening to their cities and their states as a result of an industry that is racist from top to bottom and throughout.
Yeah, well, we've talked on other shows about critical race theory or the culture wars, and then on other ones about the wealth gap. And housing is sort of the intersection of both, because owning a home has always been the path for building wealth in this country in particular. And then when you add to that a system that is so inculcated with a bias against people, particularly African Americans, I mean, that's sort of the political, social fault line in America. Unless you pull the covers off of all of these issues and begin to deal with issues like reparations, I don't see how we ever get to the next point. Even those who do deep dives and analysis in this space, they're frustrated about how we get to the next point. But we will if we keep pulling the covers off and keep having a conversation, as we try to here on State of Play.